Good afternoon. I'm Kent Ono, the National Communication Association's first Vice President, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the opening session of the 105th NCA Annual Convention. Thank you for being here. As the opening plenary session of this year's convention, I hope this event will provide a stimulating, engaging, and provocative start to our conference and will advance our understanding of this year's conference theme, Communication for Survival. NCA is pleased to partner with the Waterhouse Family Institute for the Study of Communication in Society in hosting today's opening session. The WFI was founded to highlight the centrality of communication in the creation of social change. Its goal is to serve as the center of the international network of communication scholars, practitioners, and activists working to create a more just world. WFI's sponsorship of the NCA opening session offers a fascinating opportunity for the exploration of exciting new ways that communication scholarship reaches out beyond the confines of our campuses and conferences into broader communities. Toward that end, I do want to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded land of the Piscataway peoples. The vast coastal area today known as Baltimore City, Maryland, sustained indigenous peoples until the arrival of Europeans beginning in the 1600s. Over the next 400 years, many Piscataway, Lenape, and Susquehannock communities were decimated, absorbed by larger villages or nations, and or forced by the U.S. federal government to move west beyond the Mississippi River and larger nations. We ask you to join us in acknowledging these communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. NCA also acknowledges that it is often gathered on unceded lands and that those gatherings manifested the exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the grave harm that colonialism brought to these lands, in particular the erasure of both indigenous and African identities via slavery and via racist laws that segregated all people into binary classifications of black and white. This acknowledgement demonstrates our commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Again, I want to thank you for coming. It was lovely to see so many people here at the opening session. I'm very excited. I do hope you enjoy and learn much from today's NCA opening session. Now, let me introduce our plenary panel. Now, to help introduce the plenary panel is Dr. Brian Crable, Professor of Communication at Villanova University and founding director of the Waterhouse Family Institute for the Study of Communication in Society.
Thank you so much, Kent, and thank you all for being here. And I'm very honored as director of the WFI to help be able to make this possible. And of course, all the work done by the NCA staff and the folks gathered here. I'm just really grateful and very happy to be here. And it is also my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's event, who would be Dr. Kimberly Moffitt. Dr. Moffitt is director and associate professor in the Language, Literacy, and Culture PhD program and affiliate associate professor in the Department of Africana Studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Dr. Moffitt's research focuses on mediated representations of marginalized groups and the politicized nature of black hair and the body. She has published 4 co-edited volumes, including Gladiators in Suits, Race, Gender, and the Politics of Representation and Scandal, and Blackberries and Red Bones, Critical Articulations of Black Hair and Body Politics in Africana Communities. Her current research projects continue to explore topics of colorism and the black body in Disney television programming. She also has a forthcoming edited volume on the legacy of First Lady Michelle Obama. Dr. Moffitt recently launched the Reinvent Ed podcast with Ramon Goings. The podcast brings educational experts and parents advocates together to strategize new ideas for public school reform. Finally, Dr. Moffitt is the founding parent of the Baltimore Collegiate School for Boys, a public charter school that opened its doors in 2015. She gets the pleasure and the privilege of being moderator for this fantastic gathering of folks, and I look forward to everything. Please let me welcome Dr. Moffitt, and we'll start things off.
I absolutely love such opportunities to have these conversations, but I've come to realize, especially if any event is held in Baltimore, that I'm being called to the table not because I'm a professor, but because I decided to open up a charter school for my son. And that's okay, because that was a commitment that I had personally that has become part of my advocacy work and shows up in my research. So I am very honored to have the opportunity to be before you today. Welcome to Baltimore. I know it's a little cold, but we're so glad to have you here and hope that you will enjoy the conversation today. So I have the pleasure of serving this role to start the conversation with these 5 colleagues of ours on race relations. And what better place to have such a conversation in a city that has such a complex history and even a complex contemporary history of what we're dealing with. It is interesting that for most of you, you know that the Baltimore uprisings occurred in the spring 2015. The charter school that I opened for boys opened up 4 months later, for 175, predominantly because it is a public school, so it is not something that I can say was just for black boys, but being in a city that is largely African American, most of the 175 boys in that building, including my son, were African American. And so this becomes a perfect spot. I remember I used to teach a course on The Wire when it was popular. Now my students don't know what the hell The Wire is. But when I taught that course, it was a perfect microcosm of being able to talk about what are some of the issues we're dealing with urban centers throughout our country, and being able to also talk about the role that race relations was played and how race relations played out in those urban centers. And so it is so apropos for us to be in this space at this time having this particular conversation. And I'm so glad that you're here with us to have it. The 5 colleagues that we have today will introduce themselves very briefly, and then we will immediately dive into questions so that you can hear their voices and how they are contributing to this conversation about race relations. Dottye, would you like to start us?
My name is Dottye Burt-Markowitz. I've lived in Baltimore for a long time now, since 1982, however many years that is. I was born and grew up in East St. Louis, Illinois, and grew up, there was a question about racial identity, if you want, yeah. So we're gonna do that later? Okay.
We'll come to it.
And I'm with Baltimore Racial Justice Action, which is based in Baltimore and works primarily in Baltimore, D.C. area, but also other places.
Hello, everyone. I am Rajani Gudlavalleti. I use she, her pronouns. I am the community organizing manager with Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition. I'm going to read our mission because I don't have it memorized yet. But BHRC mobilizes community members for the health, dignity, and safety of people targeted by the war on drugs and anti-sex worker policies. We advocate for harm reduction as part of a broader movement for social justice. I wanted to make sure I read that accurately because we worked very hard collectively to come up with that mission, every word of it. And that is also why I'm excited to be here to talk about communications with you all. I will also say that I am a member of the Baltimore Racial Justice Action, and Dottye and I work together in that capacity as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Janelle Wong, and I am a professor of American Studies and Asian American Studies at the University of Maryland. I am also a founder of an organization called Chinese American Progressive Action, and my connection to NCA is really through an audience member here, Heather Harris, who is the author of Neo-Race Realities in the Obama Era. And I just wanted to mention it because I met Heather, Dr. Harris, because we both had published op-eds on race in the Baltimore Sun. And so that was a really important connection for me. We've had a lot of conversations about race in the United States, but really that's been my introduction to thinking about race and communications, is our relationship.
We didn't purposely do boy-girl today. It just worked out that way, so now, David.
Hello, my name is Josue David Cisneros. I'm associate professor at University of Illinois in the Department of Communication, and I'm also an affiliate in the Department of Latino Studies, he, him, and I'm excited to be part of the panel. I've been coming to NCA since I was a doctoral student, and a lot of the people who are in the audience or who are on the program have helped, were some of the folks who helped me start thinking about the intersection of race and ethnicity and communication and social justice, including our first Vice President, Kent Ono. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right. My name is Mark Hopson. I'm Associate Professor of Communication at George Mason University. I'm also Director of African and African American Studies at George Mason University. My areas of interest and research include critical intercultural communication. GMU is primarily a health-related communication program, but we see intercultural communication as an important aspect of health within society, so I tend to roll with that. Are there any undergraduates in the house? Not a one? There's one. Shout out to you. You're starting early. I say that because I come to you as an academician, but I'm also one who has not forgotten of my past. So I recall working my way through undergraduate programs and having to work to, certainly like many of you, pay for my education. But I remember cleaning the offices of professors for quite a while, emptying trash and doing the stuff that a lot of people would frown on. And it's just interesting now to be up here in front of you as an academician myself after having that experience. I would also add that my interests include violence prevention, literacy, and other culturally related programs for youth and young adults.
Thank you. The first question that we're posing to the entire audience, just so that you understand the framing of many of their comments after that, is how do you identify racially, and how did you come to name your identity in that particular way? It's no particular order we have to respond. Whoever's ready to dive in. How do you identify racially, and how did you come to name that identity in that particular way?
I love this question.
Oh,
so
thank you.
So I identify racially as Asian Indian, and that also depends on what audience I'm in, what environment I am in, and I think it's extremely important also to recognize my position in history when I name that. So I've distinctly made an effort in my years of life to come to terms with, I am part of a very, very diverse and broad scope of human beings who have been called Asian throughout history, which also has been defined through imperialism and white supremacy. And I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, where there are lots of Asians and Pacific Islanders of a variety of backgrounds and appearances and histories to this land. And so back where I grew up, I could say I'm Telugu, and people knew what that meant. It's a very specific language in South India, and people are like, oh yeah, I knew that, I looked at you, I could tell, right? Because we know each other like that. Here in Baltimore, a majority black city, where I've experienced a lot of black-white binary, right? Mm-hmm. Right, or at least I've come to better understand the black-white binary here, is a better way of saying that. I recognize that my dark skin and the history and legacy of enslavement in this land and the relationship to Asian people in this land means I have to shift my language. And that's a lot of heavy stuff to say, that's the stuff that goes through my head every single time I'm asked the question, what are you, or what is your race? And so I proudly say I'm Asian Indian, and then deal with the follow-up questions from there.
Oh, okay.
They're encouraging us to go boy, girl.
Yeah, this is a great question. I would say I identify. I guess I have two ways to answer this question, and it also has a lot to do with context. And I would say I identify as Latino, but I also identify as white, and I can speak to both of those. I guess as far as Latino, obviously it's not a recognized race as far as the census, and there's a lot of complicated things we could say about that. there's lots of literature, including from people in our field, that talk about, Latinx as a racialization, historically, politically, also as a kind of defensive or affirmative, racial form of racialization or racial identification. I guess, speaking personally and talking about context, I grew up in the deep South. I was born and raised in Atlanta, the new Latino South, as they call it. And I grew up in a very kind of diasporic Latin American family. I had Hondurans and Cubans and Mexicans and Colombians and Puerto Ricans, and so everybody always talked about themselves as Hispanic or Hispano, against, Americanos Blancos, and so I guess even that was even, phenotypically white people within, the community. And sometimes that was used, positively, as in like, as a form of self-affirmation, and sometimes it was used, opposite to express, internalized racism. So I guess I had a sense that, that Latinidad was a kind of racialized identity, but I also, kind of after, studying also can say that, I guess I can say I identify as white. Identify, I guess, is different to say I identify with whiteness, I guess, but I guess identify as in, because, kind of, you could say white adjacent or white assumed, to use terms that some scholars have used, compared to other Latinx people. So, because of the reasons I enjoy white privilege, including against, in comparison to some of my family members. There's, I guess I don't want to take too much more time, but there's lots of interesting stories I could tell about kind of my dad, who's Honduran, and me riding in a car together, and kind of different experiences we had when I was a kid. So I guess that those are sort of some of the ways that and I guess, like you were saying, it depends on context and is complicated.
I identify as white and always have, and have never answered that question in the ways that often white people in the workshops that I've co-facilitated would answer it in order to avoid that word, either Caucasian or European American or human being. I was very aware that I was white because I grew up in the 1950s in the city of East St. Louis, which has the history of one of the most violent race riots against African Americans in this country's history. So I grew up knowing that it happened and hearing every day the obligatory racist comments of my neighbors and friends. So I knew what defined me racially from a very young age. I continue to use the term white to identify myself racially, because until we really face the reality of what that means in the history of our country and in our lives today, it's too easy to use any other term. The racial history of the US is all about centering whiteness and basing what we do and how we do it in white supremacy.
Thank you. Dr. Hobson.
Certainly. So how do I define myself racially, and then how did I come to name that identity? Well, it depends on my audience. It depends on what I am trying to achieve. It depends on my mood. You've all heard some very important terms, and I'm sure we'll come back to these terms at some point soon. But terms like white supremacy, African diaspora, and even history cannot be overlooked when we think about how we answer this question, because nothing is outside of history. But too often we, the collective we, privilege ourselves by ignoring that history. So I say to you all that the way in which we answer this question is very much political, right? And politics include how we acquire and how we utilize resources. So I go back to my audience, what I'm trying to achieve, and my mood, i.e. my sanity. Today I identify as a black man. Sometimes it's African American, and sometimes it's others, but you all know the history. You know that in terms of the African diaspora, I come from an African people. And through white supremacy, through slavery, we had those names removed and were given new names, which was supposed to create new identities. And so we go through terms like colored and Negro, Black, African American. All of those terms mean something different. They give you a great context of how to understand time in terms of certain individuals and groups. And so I think it's a very interesting question, and we certainly see more evidence of how that matters and why it matters within different contexts and different groups. But I'll leave it right there.
And I identify as Asian American and Chinese American. I am a sixth generation Chinese American here in the United States, and I really came to ethnic identity, racial identity through ethnic studies and through, so I grew up in a small town in California called Yuba City that is one of the most diverse rural places in the US, but highly segregated. To this day, it is still one of the most conservative counties in California, so the majority of voters have voted Republican there, supported Trump, and I grew up in that context. So while I'm sixth generation and pretty far from the immigrant experience, I am often, because my last name is Wong, asked to speak to immigrant issues, which I do so gladly, and I like to share information about the Asian American community that many might not know. For instance, we know that there was a Supreme Court hearing on Tuesday about DACA, and 1 out of every 7 Asian American immigrants is undocumented. That's something that my colleagues and I have been working hard to help people to understand. So I'm also, because my last name is Wong, asked often to speak to the racial position of Asian Americans in the US, and I know we'll continue that conversation.
So let's start this conversation at the micro level, and then we'll go macro to talk about more national issues or even global issues. But I first want to talk or ask the question, based on your own experience here in Baltimore or even nationally, what would you say to us, the leaders and the members of NCA, about how we can be or how we can have an impact on communicating the central role of race in all issues of social justice in this country?
I would like to answer that because I think I wrote it. I'm not sure. BRJA recently worked with a university in the city of Baltimore for under a 3-year contract with them. And as we've worked over the years, I've been doing this work for about 30 years now. BRJA has been doing it for, I'm not sure, 16 years. And I have come to see the work that we do with institutions and organizations, kind of 3 critical areas where the commitment and leadership is absolutely essential. And that's in whoever's at the top of that institution and who they're listening to around issues of race. Who's doing the hiring and what kind of procedures and processes and understanding are at the basis of how they do that. And hiring including the whole gamut of advertising, recruiting, hiring process, retention, and performance evaluation. And the third being communication. And whether that's in a large institution where there's a whole department of communication, whether it's in teaching communication or in being in an administrative role, whether it's just a small nonprofit where the executive director is the primary communicator. Whoever it is that is responsible for shaping the message and mission of that organization, it is so essential to be able to do two things and to have two things as the foundation. One is to learn the history. Mark already brought up, this is going to be a constant refrain, I believe, from this panel, is if you care about racial justice within the context of larger social justice, you have to keep learning history, especially around race. It's the foundation of informing the way you talk about and think about these issues. And for those of us who are white, that's really a lifelong effort. You can't ever get to a place where you have enough understanding of the history. And the other thing is this developing the skill of directly naming race and talking about it in clear terms, not using euphemisms, not trying to soften it, not using jargon. And we may use jargon in this context in a way because we're expecting a certain level of understanding from the audience, but we need to be able to translate that jargon into language that makes sense for the audience that we're addressing. But the directness and the naming rather than avoiding what we're really talking about. When we use the term diversity, it's become so meaningless. It can be useful if that's what we really are talking about, but are we talking about racial diversity? Are we talking about gender diversity? What are we really talking about? Name it and be clear, and don't back off because it makes us nervous to name the things that can stimulate people's defenses.
And I'd love to add to, in having done many of these workshops at these universities with Dottye and other colleagues at BRJA, is something that we've come across quite often is a desire to kind of separate from the concept of race, right? So for example, whiteness is a race. To be white is a race, that is a race, right? And it actually would take a lot of our energy in these workshops. I don't know how surprised, I was surprised at how much work it would be, right? If there was a person who by the end of this 4-hour workshop finally acknowledged and named, I have a race and it is white, then I was like, we did it. Let's all go get a beer. Like we achieved our goal. And I say that, and it's flippantly, but it's so important to recognize that, because then that is a catalyst to recognize that that person also has a position within the concept of racism, within the issues and within social justice. So this, what was it Mark said, nothing is outside of history, absolutely, and no one is outside of social justice as well, right? Because the more we think of social justice, the implicit bias is that it is a black issue, it is a poor people issue, it is a women's issue. Not exactly. And the way I've sort of translated that into the work I do now around drug user health and ending the overdose crisis, right? People are using language like this is an overdose crisis now. That is really harmful in a city like Baltimore that has been targeted and devastated by the racist anti-black war on drugs for decades, and people have been dying, and that has been met by mass incarceration. But now that we see that the systems that exist now are also sweeping everybody in, right? Incarceration and addiction and all the ways we talk. Now it's becoming, now we're able to see it more. Oh no, we need treatment services, we need this. We've always needed that. We've always needed that. And so I bring that as an example to say, if we continue to separate and say this is an issue over here in this community, soon enough that issue actually will directly affect you in your house, right? And then where are you gonna be? And so I think recognizing, right, that we are all impacted by social justice issues, and until we have this honesty with ourselves and interrogate that and have honest conversations with our peers, then we really won't get anywhere.
I'll just say that when I look as an outsider to this organization, to NCA, I think about what your field really does is and can do when it comes to thinking about social justice and race and communications is to show us and illustrate for all of us how words matter, but really how words shape institutions and are shaped by those institutions that continue to perpetuate racism.
Yeah, I love everything that has been said. I want to co-sign all of that. I guess I wanted to speak more, kind of building on Janelle's point about kind of NCA, and I guess I would say, and building on what everyone has said, really. First, we have to acknowledge, I think, the central role of race within our own discipline, and obviously this has been, disciplinarily speaking, at least a conversation that we've been having even more publicly, I guess, recently, recognizing, racialization, institutional racism, structures our professional organizations, structures our departments, our journals, our notions of merit, of good scholarship, all of that stuff, and that we have to actively work to disinvest from those things or to take proactive steps to change those structures. And I guess the second thing is realizing that kind of a lot of times it's easy to feel comfortable in the kind of the presumably insular academic world, but kind of realizing that world is tied to and is part of this broader world, where these, and so the struggles in this community and in this world are tied to the struggles outside of it. Yeah, those are the two things I would say.
So what would I say to leaders and members of NCA about how they can have an impact on communicating the central role of race issues in the United States? I've been coming to NCA for a long time, and we've had a good many of these conversations. I would challenge my peers to move beyond these feel-good stories about diversity and move beyond the extreme issues that we see every day in the news, and we begin to look at the subtle ways in which white supremacy, i.e. racism, kills the soul of individuals and groups. It happens in the classroom, it happens in the meeting room, it happens out in the streets. I mean, it even happens here at our annual meeting. And so I would say we need to move beyond the privilege of being comfortable with coming into a room like this and having this discussion, and then going out into the world and not really acting on what it is we know. Before I told myself to stop using the word diversity, I used to have a definition for it. And that definition was simply moving beyond sensitivity to responsibility. Because you all know what you're hearing here. And if you don't know it well, you've heard it. But how does it matter? How do you enact it on a daily basis? And so at this point, it's time to stop being sensitive. It's time to stop being aware. And it's time to start acting on the knowledge that you have.
Thank you. Let's go macro for a moment and talk about the 2020 primary campaign. Oh, you know you want to talk. How much should racial justice advocates and allies like yourself be focusing our conversations on the need for concrete and immediate changes or versus radical forms of sanctuary and abolition?
May I?
Absolutely.
You said we could pass on certain questions, so I'm going to keep this short. My allies let me down last election.
2016?
Exactly. So we hear all this talk about what's important to us, what we support, what we value, what we want this nation to be, and yet our actions don't reflect our words. And I'll leave it at that. So in terms of what to expect this go around, I'll leave that rhetoric for you all.
Anyone else want to take that?
The piece of it that I would speak to is the kind of either-or phrasing of it. Having been through many, in my lifetime, many issues, many strategies, many tactics, it feels true to me that that action that Mark is stressing is the important thing. And I don't know that any of us are so brilliant and have such a vision of the future that we can define what strategy is going to get us to the place that we want to go. If we are acting toward justice, and we do it in a way that we're being authentic about who we are and what understanding we have of what we're trying to accomplish, then whether we're in the really revolutionary kind of change organizing or in the help people out right now because people are suffering because of racism and white supremacy. I don't care, just so long as you're doing something.
Yeah, so last week I was at the National Drug Policy Reform Conference, which was in St. Louis, and I've been going to this conference for a few years, and every time, and it's every other year, and every time we all gather together and we're talking about the devastatingly increasing rise of overdose rates and policing, and we have to react, and it's very reactionary. Okay, it keeps rising, what are we gonna do? And we get together and we hope, okay, now we're gonna find solutions, at least we're coming together to find solutions. 2 years later, wow, it's even worse now. And so it's been on my mind for the past week because that was really upsetting. But one conversation that really kind of uplifted me was when we just said, you know what, I just wanna be able to talk about pleasure and liberation. Can we talk about that? I'm tired of talking about survival. I'm tired of being reactionary. And I think that is something that I see very often, especially with that election. I wasn't surprised the election turned out the way it did. And I was really annoyed with all my white friends and loved ones who were so upset. And I'm like, do not call me first. And people still call me first. I'm like, you need to figure out and interrogate why I'm not surprised right now. Because we've been doing this. We've been doing this. It was set up that way. Everything has been set up this way. And then the more we work in a reactionary way, the more frustrating it can be. So yes, in my line of work, we absolutely need to do what we can to save lives today, to help people live one more day. Absolutely. I do that every single day, all day long. And while doing that, I also say, what does liberation look like for you? Can we talk about this vision of the future? Something beautiful? Like, can we talk about pleasure? And that's what I would love is so yes, let's talk about abolishing ICE, please, and abolishing the prison system, and not just get stuck in like this vision-y space, but how can we have those be in collaboration, live today and dream of tomorrow, right? How do we do that? I think it's possible.
This, I think, is a tough question that we struggle with, and it is, to put it another way, if we are not radical, are we complicit? And it's, I think, a conversation worth having. I don't have the answers, but as I've moved through life, I've become more convinced that we need it all, but we cannot, so yes, we all need to do at least something. Something is better than nothing. But if we don't push ourselves to do the most radical thing, then sometimes we get stuck for 20 years in this place of diversity language, for instance. And so I think there is not an easy answer to your question, but I also think this is the moment we have to push ourselves a little bit harder to say, well, yes, everything matters, but can we do a little bit more? Because what we're doing right now is clearly still not enough.
And let's probe that a bit, because what are some of the impediments to doing this work? And what would you say could be the extension of doing a little bit more so that we're not stuck here 20 years from now? Anybody? I know where you stand, Dr. Hobson.
What could you say that again?
Yeah, what are some of the impediments of this work? Like, what is keeping us from moving forward? And in your personal opinion, what could be some of the strategies or models that does allow us to do a little more than what Janelle is suggesting, Dr. Wong is suggesting, so that we aren't stuck in this same spot 20 years from now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to answer that, but can I go back and say something to the previous
Sure,
question?
absolutely.
Okay, I'll work my way towards that for that one. I guess I want to agree with the message of doing something that Dottye said, and I guess part of the one of the major maybe impediments to that, there are many, but I guess that we could focus on, is risk, and vulnerability, and there's a lot of, especially for white folks, a lot of risk and vulnerability involved, and that can be a barrier. But having to recognize that that risk and vulnerability is already people are already experiencing that every day. It just so happens that it's not you who's experiencing it. But I wanted to go back to the question about, like, the previous question, and say, I guess, one, to agree with kind of the importance of history and recognizing the continuity. I mean, speaking about the immigration context, there's a lot we could say about how the infrastructure for every horror that we're seeing now has been laid over the last 30 years, and so the importance of recognizing that history, and not kind of only focusing on the current moment as different, although clearly it is different. And then about kind of the radical piece, and I guess I want to agree that doing something and engaging in that risk, but sometimes the easy thing to do may not be the most the most transformative or effective thing to do. And I think one of the terms that to throw the term in there that gets used in some circles, especially abolitionist circles, is non-reformist reforms. And I think thinking about ways that we can act for change that actually break down or disinvest from the structures that are actually causing harm, and that's, I think, gets directly to this language of diversity, right? Like, that's important, but that language of diversity can actually kind of can be so generic that it fails to acknowledge the real inequalities that are going on. So I think kind of taking a step beyond those kinds of solutions, what are things that we can do to so, for example, in abolishing ICE is an example of this in the immigration context that people talk about, or decriminalizing the act of border crossing. I guess we can take kind of lessons from those social justice struggles about kind of that step further, although it does involve that risk and that vulnerability that
Is the risk and vulnerability about having to relinquish power, or is it, I don't know what it is like on the other side that's so different than where we are now, so that's why I'm not moving forward?
I mean, I think those are the same thing. I mean, especially for a lot of people, right? Like, especially if you benefit from the structures and situation now, then thinking about what's on the other side inherently involves risk and, a sense of potential, vulnerability or loss. But I mean, I think going back to Mark's point about part of that transformative work of recognizing that, those systems are hurting everyone, although obviously in different ways, can help us to,
You know, a lot of the issues that we deal with today are not new. A lot of this is cyclical. A lot of this is something we've seen before. So today the rhetoric is being fearful of the other, and there have been other individuals and groups who were constructed in much the same way. I would say this to you all as well. We are among the youngest nations, well, one of the youngest nations perhaps in the world, right? And we are a land that spent more time enslaved than free. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned in terms of how we move forward. Dr. Moffitt asked the question, well, what do we do? I say the personal is political. So you put your money, you put your actions where your mouth is. It's about that time of year. We'll see our families, we'll see our friends, and we'll have an opportunity to raise issues or to avoid issues. You'll have an opportunity soon there enough to put your vote where it counts. So again, the personal is political. You act on what you believe. You walk the walk. I would also add to this idea of liberation and language and being proactive. That is so important. Asante calls it liberation language, but it's about being proactive rather than reactive. So looking at ways of thinking and acting differently and understanding that what we've done so far is not necessarily working. I think about the work of Ibram X. Kendi and this idea of the history of the racist idea, and I think about all the connections that have been made right around Virginia, where I live, and throughout Northern Virginia and well into Maryland. And I think about all the connections, all the small things, the interpersonal things that we would call them, and how those things tie into one another to create this system, this structure that we then hide from because it's faceless, because we can claim not to be a part of it or not to support it, and yet that hegemonic force continues on. So again, the personal is political. Act on what you believe. Start there. For me, it involves working with young men of color, talking to them, for example, about violence prevention. I use communication strategies to do that. I use definitions. I use all kinds of activities. But talking to them about things that they may not understand when confronted with it. So doing it at an early age. We oftentimes here talk about putting public speaking in either elementary schools or middle schools, but I'd like to see African American studies, critical intercultural communication studies in schools, so that when we begin to have these really charged dialogues, people understand the difference between prejudice and discrimination and racism and privilege. And all these terms don't become conflated to the point that we walk away with little to no understanding.
That bringing up the subject of risk really got to me, because it's a topic we discuss a lot within Baltimore Racial Justice Action, because we are a multiracial organization. And risk is thought of so differently by race. And it has such different truths associated with it. It's phenomenal to me in the years that I've been doing this work, how hesitant those of us who are white can be about speaking out in even the most basic kinds of ways against racism that's right in front of us. And we think of it as taking a risk. That is not taking a risk. It is simply speaking values that we say we hold. And to not do that is simply cowardice and not living up to our own values. Weighing risk is something that's important for any of us to do in the work of social justice. But for those of us who are white, we need to challenge ourselves about what is really the risk I'm taking. My husband is a white Jewish man who was head of the faculty council at his institution. And he taught me so much. I learned so much from him because he knew how to stand up, say the truth, not try to alienate people, but let it go if people are alienated. And after he would do something like that, make a public statement to the president, people would come up to him afterward, white people, white friends, and say, "I'm so glad you said that." And that's too much of what we as white people tend to do on these things. We appreciate other people standing up rather than taking that risk ourselves. For people of color, the risk is phenomenal. I can do something that if Rajani did exactly the same thing in the same context, I would get by with it, and at worst, have somebody tell me, I thought you were offensive. Rajani might get fired. And if you think that's an exaggeration, I can give you lots of examples of how it happens.
Yeah, and I, in going back to the concept of like impediments to the work, I think one of the things that makes me spin in my brain is just public amnesia. Like we just forget a lot. For example, Ellen, from Ellen, recently hung out with George W. Bush, right, at like a football game. I don't know if anybody see that, right? And they're just kicking it. And I'm watching this, I'm like, what is Ellen doing right now? And everyone's like, oh, George W. Bush is so cute now. Like he's giving Michelle Obama like Werther's candies, and he's like, kicking it with Ellen. And I'm like, he is a warmonger. Yeah, he's evil, in my opinion. People might disagree in this room. I don't care. He was not good as a president. He's racist. He was in charge of the murder of many, many, many brown and black people. And that was very known at the time when he was president, right? There was a lot of animosity to him. There was a lot of resistance to him at the time, right? So so now we've shifted the narrative. In my young lifetime, my adult lifetime, we have shifted the narrative of a president. That blows my mind. And how quickly we're able to do that and forget history, right? And that is because he is a white man with power. So he has the power to shift his story very quickly. Very, very quickly. Whereas in a lot of the work we're doing in social justice work, we do, and I say this specifically in this group, a lot of the work I do as an organizer is, yes, bringing people together, giving out supplies, meeting people's needs. It's mostly about shifting narratives. Most of the work I do is community dialogues, talking with folks, saying, what is your actual experience with the war on drugs, with racism, with police? And we talk to each other. And we say, yeah, people ignore that this has happened, or this is what the policies were when I was growing up, now we're here. We talk about how we need to shift the narrative of drug use, of lots of different things, and particularly race and racism and history, it gets forgotten, right? So shifting narratives, I think, is something that is in y'all's wheelhouse, and it is something that white men in power have been using for a long time, and we need to take that. We need to cite our sources, like when we use the word intersectional, we can't just throw that word around anytime we just want to say two things that are together in the same thing. No, that's not what it means. Kimberly Crenshaw coined that term. We need to give her credit. She's a black woman. We need to give credit, cite sources, right? We need to do that, remember history, remember stories of resistance that people of color have fought for, instead of hiding that. We need to remember those things and use that in our narrative shifts now, opposed to letting that, that tool only be used by those in power.
So I think Mark is right that this is not new. However, one of the most powerful things about racism and Islamophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment is that it comes at us in new ways and in new forms. And so to just give you an example of this, in our own communities, we see anti-blackness, we see anti-immigrant sentiment, sometimes from these unexpected places. So in the state of Maryland, who killed the sanctuary state status of Maryland? It was really Chinese immigrants who protested en masse. That's old, but it's also a new source of protest against sanctuary status. When we see the face of the anti-affirmative action movement today, it's the same rhetoric of reverse discrimination, but it is coming from new faces that look like mine. And so one of the greatest impediments, I think, to working on racism is that it's always evolving. The sources are evolving and changing, even though a lot of the script is the same. And so how we can move beyond that, I've noticed definitely in my students, is you have to tell your students to look to their own communities for to identify anti-blackness for what it is, to identify anti-immigrant sentiment for what it is, to identify Islamophobia, because they think it's in the past, or they think it rests with one group. It does not. And when students recognize that, you can see their attitudes change.
It's a great point. And I think it ties very nicely to the next question that I wanted to raise is, so how does the rise of racial conservatism within some of these non-white groups, how does that challenge progressive racial politics and social justice movements?
Sorry, I laugh because it's difficult and I laugh at things. So it is a rise of racial conservatism, and then it's not at the same time. So groups of color have been positioned against each other since we've all been brought here. That is how white supremacy keeps its position in power. And so by having us fight with each other as people of color, we're not really considering how we are keeping certain status the same, right? So when we have, oh God, I'm like losing my words, but when we have concepts of, okay, sorry, let me just root this in. I grew up in Silicon Valley. I grew up quite poor. We dealt with eviction, bankruptcy, etc. As an Indian person in that area, that is very uncommon. Indian immigrants are very affluent. I grew up around a lot of affluence of Indian people, but we were this ostracized family because we weren't that, right? So I grew up in the 80s and 90s around affluent, conservative Asian immigrants, direct immigrants. I watched these folks get their citizenship, right? And I watched my mom get her citizenship to battle them, to say, I'm gonna vote for everything they're not voting for. And I watched this happen. And a lot of it had to do with capitalism, the American dream, these concepts that my family, right, my aunties and uncles were fed to come here, right? They said, oh, if you come here and be our engineers, then we'll give you what you need. You'll get the big house. Okay, what about when the tech boom with the bubble pops, everyone lost their job? That happened twice in my lifetime. My dad lost his job, my brother lost his job. And so these, conservatism is fed, in my experience, very much fed to my family and loved ones of immigrants in order to create that separation so that we're blinded from what's really going on and blinded from working in solidarity with other people of color who've already experienced that for decades longer than we had. And so that is just something on my mind that I wanted to say.
So I want to push back a little at this idea that this is all in service to, that the intra-group conflict among people of color is all in service to white supremacy. I think we're seeing something different now, and there's, I think, some agency in certain groups of color, I'll use my own, Chinese Americans, in perpetuating in perpetuating anti-blackness, in opposing affirmative action, in opposing sanctuary cities. They are perpetuating then a kind of anti-Latinx mentality, and we're seeing it in very real and effective ways. So, for instance, yes, people know that Asian Americans have been opposing affirmative action in elite universities. But right next door in Howard County, there was a New York Times story yesterday and today about how white and Asian parents, while they are saying that they value diversity, have basically gone to the mat to resist any kind of integration in the K through 12 level. This is something I think that we need to pay attention to. We're looking now at groups that are non-white, that are racially conservative, but they also opposed Trump, and they identify as Democrats, and they use the language of racial grievance, but they're also making moves to end equality for other groups. And so this is a new terrain that I think we need to be really attentive to.
What role does class play in that?
It's not just class. So if you look at New York City, Asian Americans, for instance, have been pretty vociferous in opposing the integration of specialized high schools there. That group are actually the poorest group in New York City, Chinese Americans who have been opposing the reforms that would integrate New York City's specialized high schools. And so we're seeing a kind of multi-class opposition to some, I think, important reforms for educational equity.
I would argue that race and class are inherently connected. I mean, if you think about the ways in which someone mentioned earlier, the ways in which capitalism works as a system, much like racism, it consumes individuals and groups, and then it rewards us for complicity. So what we find is that, so there's this interesting argument going on with a group called ADOS, right? These would be American descendants of slavery. And this idea is that in the fight for reparations, H.R. 40 begins that discussion, at least, most currently. In the fight for reparations, there's a group claiming that certainly black Americans are deserving of reparations. And so the argument becomes whether or not essentially one is black enough, right? How black are you? What is your history? When did you get here, so to speak? The other side argues that to create this particular group takes away from the diaspora or even Pan-Africanism as we see it. In other words, it hinders the connection for people of color across the globe. So the argument is whether or not black Americans have access to these resources and whether or not we can maintain these connections worldwide if we should indeed take steps forward in accessing those resources. So again, capitalism, racism, inherently connected in many ways.
I think the ADOS is a wonderful example, not a good example, but a wonderful example of talking about the complexity of where we are around racial justice issues and how we have allowed ourselves to be complicit in some of these debates, which in fact does create additional conflict and disillusionment among groups instead of bringing folks together to fight against racial injustice.
And I would add this, the thought I was reminded as I listened to my peers, when we think about white racism as a system, again, you remove faces, you remove bodies, and it continues to work, whether or not it is supported by individuals, right? So, again, it shows up in different ways, but in some ways, if we look at our history, we've seen it before, right? It's not completely new. But I think there is something to be said about educating each other on how to know it when we see it. I think about racism in the same way as I think about violence, because racism is indeed violent. But one of the things that I work with young people on is recognizing it when they see it, right? Because violence can be verbal, right? It can be yelling, screaming, putting somebody down, cursing them out. It could be physical, certainly, hitting, kicking, but it could also be extreme tickling, right? It could be also holding somebody against their will, right? It could be throwing something at somebody and not necessarily hitting them, but making them think you're going to hit them, right? It's emotional and it's sexual. A lot of times students and even adults don't know it because they don't have the language, they don't have naming for the issues, and so it goes completely unrecognized. Racism is much the same way. We sometimes confuse prejudice for racism. Personal prejudice is not systemic racism. I may not like your black sweater. That does not make me racist. That is my personal preference. But if I tell you that those of you who are wearing black sweaters must sit in the back, that becomes discriminatory. And if it happens without me saying so, now it's systemic, it's structural, it's societal. So knowing it when you see it is really, really important. And I think that's where most of us miss the mark.
Yeah, that educational work and self-work is key even within, right, affected communities like you're talking about, because, well, like you said, racial capitalism it recruits people to, participate in that system. I guess this gets back to the question you asked about strategy and about, refusing strategy that is kind of singularly focused on, like, my group getting what we think we deserve, oftentimes at the expense of another group, which is what happens in these cases of, right, these, Asian American communities using the language of racial redress and rights to actually, entrench racial discrimination, but protection for themselves, right? So I guess it gets back to this question about strategy and about thinking about work across a broader social justice, racial justice work across a broader range of communities rather than just the community, that we think we come from, or, yeah.
So we're all, because I want to make sure we leave on this point, or with this thought in mind. So we're all leaving this space. Many of us are heading back to classrooms. We're certainly in the next couple of weeks possibly with our families, and certainly our neighborhoods. And I'd like you to wrap up or offer a last point of what next? What do we do? Do we have some strategies you can suggest in those classrooms with our families and our neighborhoods?
Well, I am not seeing my family for Thanksgiving, but I have a brother who I'm pretty sure voted for Trump, and he is a Southern Baptist minister. And I've been thinking for months now about having a conversation with him the next time I see him. And I really, really believe we have to start talking honestly across this chasm that has developed. Because I don't define my brother as a racist any more than I define myself as a racist, because we all were conditioned to consider our whiteness as primary. But I do think he put other things before racial justice. And in this country, with this history, I think we can never do that. We will never get past it if it's not the primary value. We'll never overcome this, what's been called the original sin, if we don't first work against it and then add all the other things that are important to us. And all those other things are connected to it. They're directly connected.
30 seconds.
Okay. So what's on my mind right now is thinking about what we call affinity spaces, and I guess I'm talking to my fellow people of color, how important it is for us to have spaces with each other to talk through our personal traumas and personal experiences and the place and space and time of those experiences, find commonality with each other, and then develop our perspectives, right? Even in the conversation we have just been having, my understanding of Asian folks and anti-Blackness is even more advanced now, having this conversation, and I wish for more of this, right? Where API people can come together and talk through, this is what my experience has been, help me to understand it, right? We need to do that, but when we are asked to be in spaces where I feel often we are having to help white people along, I don't have the time to do that as much, right? So I'm just being honest and saying that's what's on my mind right now, is in order for all of us to advance, we all need to have affinity spaces with our people of our similar racial or ethnic groups to be able to work through and wrestle these ideas.
Many of us are teachers, and I've come to recognize that the classroom is a very unique space, and that is because so much of what we process today are sound bites and one-off conversations and even one dinner with a family member. But in the classroom, we have this opportunity to be in the classroom with people we don't agree with necessarily, and to have not just one conversation, not just two conversations, but 25 conversations with those people. And so I think that is a very unique opportunity for all of us to have sustained conversations around exactly these topics. And it is, I think, not a radical, but an important way to communicate around race and social justice. I'll also just end with this. There is so much pain in this time, but there is also joy. There's so much joy in the community that we build around confronting these issues. And so I think it's really important to suck the life and recognize that this is also a time where you meet people who really care about a lot of the things that you care about. Anyone?
I agree with all of that. I mean, I think the other thing, since you talked about the teaching, I mean, I think the other piece of that is just really realizing that, I think that there's still a sense of for a lot of people of research as a separate space, like research is where I do my thing and I work on these other things in the classroom, or I work, I think just realizing that that this research is already, we don't have to worry, people don't have to worry about politicizing their research because it's already politicized and it's already being politicized. And so we need to really think about, on one hand, how our research will be used in ways that we don't intend against communities of color or other marginalized communities, but on the other hand, really think about, really thinking about how our position as researchers can join those struggles and can help to position the voices of communities of color, of marginalized communities, can amplify the voices of scholars of color, can challenge those spaces within our own discipline. I think we need to, not just in our spaces of teaching or in our work, but also in our scholarly work, in our research teams, that we need to realize that work should also be part of these struggles.
All right, so in the spirit of Freddie Gray, Jordan Davis, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, I say to you all that I am not here to condemn Donald Trump. I am not surprised by Donald Trump. I am not even taken aback. Donald Trump has always been in the history of this land. So I would encourage you all not to get too caught up in berating that individual. I prefer you berate the ideology surrounding the individual and groups, the values surrounding the individual and groups. The matters of importance. Those are the things that we need to pay attention to. So if you ask me what closing thoughts I would leave you with, I'd leave you with the same thoughts I leave my students every time we meet. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm going to tell you to do something. If you understand that racism is indeed a system, meaning it is operating regardless of what you might think or do, then we know it takes some disrupting to end a system. So how will you disrupt the system? How will you disrupt it when you leave this room? How will you disrupt it when you go back to your institutions? How will you disrupt it for those students that don't necessarily get the opportunities to be seen or heard? Even those students that didn't make it to your classrooms, how will you disrupt systems of oppression?
I want to leave you today with 3 themes that seem to stand out, very short. Knowing our history and recognizing that we need to be lifelong learners around issues of ideology and race in this country. Making sure that we are holding multiple conversations, whether it is in our classroom spaces, our neighborhoods, with our families, etc. And then finally, recognizing the joy in the work that's being done. Can we please thank our panelists today?